Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in San Diego, California today. Bob is off on assignment. I think he's counting votes in the Michigan primary. Today, we're going to be talking about one of our topics that we revisit from time to time, which is state and corporate surveillance of environmental activists, indigenous activists. And joining me is Adam Federman, who is a reporting fellow at Type Investigations, who's written extensively on corporate and space police spying of environmental activists, much of which has appeared in The Guardian, but Adam's also been published in Politico, The Nation, The Washington Post, Wired, and many other publications. Adam, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. You put an article out that was in Grist and on Type Investigations with some newly obtained documents about the U.S. government monitoring environmental activists, particularly around the Keystone XL pipeline fight. You report that it happened sooner than many people had thought. Maybe you can start off with talking about that a little bit. Like, how early did it start? Who are they surveilling? And then we can go from there.
Sure. This is the latest in a series of stories that I've done based on FBI and State Department records, essentially documenting government surveillance of the anti-pipeline movement. And previous records that I'd obtained showed that the FBI had opened an investigation into activists in Houston, affiliated with Sands Blockade in early 2013. And so these new records, which are also from the FBI out of its Minneapolis office, show that they'd actually taken an interest in Keystone Pipeline groups about a year earlier in February 2012, with a focus on mostly Native American groups in South Dakota, which they described as being a potential violent threat and lumped in this counterterrorism file. So it gives us a more complete sense of the FBI's approach to the Keystone Pipeline campaign in its early days.
There's even a quote that they use in some of the documents where they compare them to a radical militia, I believe.
That is correct. And that was specifically in reference to what they called the Native Youth Movement, a new threat, apparently, in the FBI's eyes. And that, I'm glad that you mentioned that, in part because that section of the file indicates that the agency had actually opened a separate investigation into Native youth and what they characterized as extremist groups in Indian country. Mm-hmm. But I filed a follow-up request for those records, and the FBI denied my request, and then I appealed, and the DOJ also denied my appeal. So there's more out there that they're not willing to disclose.
Is that because are they saying it's an open file? I guess they don't really give you a reason because it's the government, but no, I assume it's maybe still an open file.
It's not an open investigation as far as I know. They said that releasing the records would reveal law enforcement methods and techniques, which is an exemption that they can use to withhold records. Yeah. And it's very difficult to challenge legally. In fact, I had extensive conversations with a FOIA attorney about trying to challenge the DOJ's ruling on my appeal, and they were basically said it's a dead end. You're just not going to get anywhere.
And at least some of this was happening on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which actually 50 years ago this week it's the 51st anniversary, I think, of Wounded Knee, where the FBI actually had a standoff with the American Indian movement.
Yeah. Absolutely. They actually reference Wounded Knee in this FBI file and give a potted history of what happened there in a parenthetical. Yeah, there were active groups throughout South Dakota, tribal groups and also rural landowners who were organizing to oppose the Keystone Pipeline, beginning really in 2010, 2011 with the Mother Earth Accord. And one of the actions that I write about in the story is this blockade in Wobblies, South Dakota, which is on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And these were massive trucks that were coming actually from Texas traveling to the tar sands to service pipeline equipment up there. And word got out on the Pine Ridge Reservation And about 75 people came to this area where the trucks were trying to cross tribal land and essentially told them that they had to turn around and find another way. And this was something, obviously, this was the beginning in some ways of these kinds of tactics, which the FBI would come to take a special interest in. But at that particular time, this was spring of 2012, it garnered almost no media attention, and a handful of activists were arrested. Their names are included in the FBI file, though they're redacted. So this is the kind of thing that the FBI was tracking and keeping tabs on, including open public meetings with government agencies about the pipeline.
And we have a lot of evidence of them doing surveillance. Is there any evidence of them doing any active disruption or putting agent provocateurs into any of these groups in this period, which is, something the FBI has a history of. So wouldn't surprise me if they keep doing it.
And they've turned up in other Keystone-related files. The files on Sands Blockade indicated that they had used informants as part of that investigation. These files don't explicitly say anything about that. They seem to be, what's not redacted seems to be mostly based on open source info and analysis from the field office. But I do have a lot of questions about what the FBI, what kinds of operations the FBI engaged in between sort of 2013, when this file ends, and the beginning of the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, because it's clear from the reference to this other investigation that they've refused to release that the FBI was actively monitoring indigenous groups in South Dakota. And we know what happened at Standing Rock. There were spirit camps that were established in South Dakota during the Keystone Pipeline campaign that served as a precedent for what we saw at Standing Rock. So I really do think there's more to this story, and hopefully eventually the FBI or these records will see the light of day.
You mentioned the Sands Blockade. That was a campaign that I was involved with. If Sands Blockade starts in 2011 in East Texas, we've also covered that on the Green and Red podcast. Is there evidence of federal surveillance of the Sands Blockade back in this period, 2011, 2012? Because I believe fall 2011, early 2012 is when they were most active fighting a sort of extension of the pipeline.
There's definitely evidence that the FBI was monitoring Keystone Pipeline campaigners in Houston toward the end of 2012, beginning of 2013. And I know that activists who were directly involved with Sands Blockade were monitored and ended up in this file as well. So I can't recall offhand if Sands Blockade is mentioned by name, but I wouldn't be surprised. And clearly the investigation that the FBI opened into the activities in Texas covered some of the actions that Sands Blockade was involved in. Yeah, for sure.
And we're seeing the feds begin this surveillance of what they see as more like extremist groups, right? So I think a term they use is environmental extremists. And so they're talking about native groups on the Pine Ridge Reservation. We're talking about a campaign in East Texas, which is very much maybe rooted in radical forest movements from the Northwest. But then we also see this campaign also goes mainstream, right? So there's an event in September 2011 called the Tar Sands Action that was called for by environmental writer Bill McKibben, where there was 2 weeks of nonviolent civil disobedience at the Obama White House. I actually got arrested at it myself. I think something like 12 or 1,300 people got arrested at it. Lots of nice liberals trying to put pressure on Obama to do something about Keystone, to do something about climate. How closely were the feds watching this organizing, watching this action, watching this movement, which at one point it begins to overlap with what's going on in South Dakota. It begins to overlap with what's going on in East Texas. Like lots of people who were at the Tar Sands Action went to the Tar Sands Blockade, for example.
Yep. Yeah, it speaks to the scale and scope of the movement, even at that early period. Another facet of this surveillance network is the State Department's intelligence division, which also sought to monitor Keystone Pipeline protest. And these are records that I've also obtained, hundreds of pages. And I would say that the State Department probably took a greater interest in sort of the protest activity that was taking place in and around DC, and also the actions that were targeting State Department facilities across the country. So you had, and of course, the State Department, these agencies don't work in isolation. So they're collaborating, communicating with FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces and Department of Homeland Security fusion centers, and sharing information with each other.
One of the things that the State Department was watching, which I know a little bit about this, was the Keystone Pledge of Resistance, where the target was actually the State Department and trying to pressure the State Department and federal buildings, trying to pressure Obama to reject the pipeline, and that people were going to commit mass amounts of nonviolent civil disobedience if he didn't, or if it looked like he wasn't going to. And what did some of these State Department files tell us about their monitoring of the Keystone Pledge of Resistance or other related activity?
Yeah, they were very keyed into that Credo campaign, and I think partly because, as you know, it really took off. You had tens of thousands of people signing the pledge, trainings and actions in cities across the country. And so this was something that the State Department was following very closely, including identifying activists associated with that campaign, monitoring everything from candlelight vigils in cities across the country to other forms of protest, and including an individual who was arrested for trespassing in New Hampshire after taking photos of a passport office. So I would say they cast a pretty wide net, and you probably can speak to this better than I can, but clearly that Credo campaign, perhaps because it did bring together such a kind of a motley crew of different kinds of activists, perhaps posed a unique sort of symbolic threat both to the administration and to TransCanada, the company behind the pipeline.
Yeah, I would say that the sort of intent of that campaign was definitely, the point of intervention was with Obama. And so that's why State Department offices and federal buildings were targeted. I think we did one action, which was at TransCanada's offices in Houston, but most everything else were at federal buildings. And we actually did one at the actual State Department in DC. And the idea was that we were going to undermine him with his constituency. With this, he had just been reelected, but it still was a pretty potent force to have what was largely a bunch of white, older environmentalists out protesting and getting arrested in disagreement with his potential decision on Keystone. And what was their name for the State Department agency?
Yeah, you're gonna test my memory if it's an unusual name. I think it's the Diplomatic Intelligence Protection Division or something like that, DIP. It's an obscure division within the State Department that is tasked with protecting State Department assets and property within the United States, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
And another piece of what they were doing is that in many ways, what the Keystone fight was about was the pipeline crossing the Canadian-U.S. border. And so therefore, it was a decision that was like, quote unquote, foreign policy. And so therefore, John Kerry, or I think it was Secretary of State in 2013, and Obama, it was in some ways a foreign policy decision.
It required State Department approval, essentially. And the State Department was the agency that was doing the environmental review, evaluating the pipeline's impact. So that went through many iterations and was quite controversial in terms of the way that it characterized greenhouse gas emissions and overall environmental impacts from the pipeline if it were to be constructed. But yeah, Keystone is unique in some ways because it does cross an international boundary, and that gave the State Department the kind of high profile role that it played during the campaign to stop it. And Kerry's residence in DC was targeted by protesters in nonviolent ways, and that certainly comes up in these documents frequently.
Yeah, they don't like it when we show up at their houses, so we'll say that. Yeah. And just to also further contrast that point about it crossing the border is that the southern leg of Keystone, which ran from Oklahoma to Houston, which is what the Sands Blockade and communities East Texas communities were protesting didn't require that State Department approval. And so Obama just signed off on that pretty quickly.
That's right.
I think early 2012.
Yes. And then I think he even gave a speech at the Cushing Pipeline pipe yard where during
it's a famous picture of Obama in front of the pipes.
Yes.
Maybe we'll use that on the thumbnail that we promote this.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Part of his all of the above strategy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Did the FBI or the State Department respond to any questions about any of this?
Yeah, the State Department did respond to some of my questions, not all of them, essentially acknowledging that they value free speech and First Amendment protected activity, but also have the obligation to protect State Department assets and all the rest. The FBI did not respond to any of my questions and essentially said that they don't comment on records that have been released through the Freedom of Information Act, and said that the records speak for themselves.
Yep. I've seen that. I've seen them quoted saying that before. And that was the primary way of gathering information in this article is through the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, plus interviews with people more in opposition to these pipelines. And
yeah, that's right. The records, interviews with activists in South Dakota, and trying to piece together some of what came of this surveillance, essentially. What was the outcome? How did it affect activists after Standing Rock in particular? And I think some of those questions remain unanswered because there's a bit of a gap between the files that I have and what unfolded at Standing Rock. And hopefully some of that material will become available down the road.
And we've been talking about Standing Rock, and you talk about it in the article. Just to move into what sort of precedent this surveillance sets is in the article, you talk about movement lawyers and organizers reviewing the documents who comment that it serves as a blueprint for further work for No DAPL and Cop City, so part of me thinking about this is just the historical context, because we see a long history of surveillance and repression there's the Green Scare moment with like where they go after radical forest defenders and animal rights activists. But we can take this back to the Black Panthers, and we can take this back to the Wobblies. And so I'm curious, is there a unique precedent that's set with the Keystone fight that serves as a blueprint for the No DAPL movement, for the Stop Cop City movement?
I don't necessarily think this is a precedent that was set, but one of the things that becomes clear in these files is the fact that the FBI in particular, and then state and local law enforcement agencies, developed a very close relationship with TransCanada, the company behind the pipeline, which I think fueled this sort of ideological narrative that the activists opposed to the Keystone Pipeline were somehow dangerous or even domestic terrorists. And TransCanada, which it delivered to lawmakers and other public officials along the pipeline route.
And law enforcement to some of the fusion centers. That's
right, which profiled individual activists, including yourself, but also I think encouraged district attorneys to prosecute activists involved in the movement on felony charges, basically.
I guess one question I have about that is that I believe that story about TransCanada's PowerPoint came out about 10, 11 years ago. And there's where they were seeding these people are eco-terrorists, these people, there's like all kinds of stuff about sabotage and bomb making and all of that sort of stuff, which is pretty ridiculous. But there's also where since then we've seen this sort of flowering of it's the where Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. It's like we're it sort of started the when they fight you period, because we see escalated charges, we see slap suits, all of that sort of stuff, which I think does actually set an important precedent for at least the climate movement and the anti-pipeline movements.
Absolutely. And I think part of what was also revealing, in terms of what happened at Standing Rock, is the fact that many of those tactics ultimately failed when it came to Keystone, because the activist movement didn't simply walk away, and the movement grew and ultimately succeeded when Obama rejected it, which I do think accounts to some extent for the harsh and brutal response that that we observed at Standing Rock, with the hiring of private security firms and the sort of massive use of state power to combat what was a nonviolent movement. So I think that
even more so with Cop City now too.
Absolutely, can bring it right up to the present. And the use by the state, Georgia, using these enhanced domestic terrorism laws to go after activists, which is hugely dangerous.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting these laws and this, what I see as an abuse of state power in South Dakota and North Dakota, it's from right-wing politicians. In Georgia, it's from, a right-wing governor, but it's also in Georgia, it's from Black Democrats, like the leadership of Atlanta and over the Atlanta Police Department are like Black Democrats. It's just something worth noting, is that we're seeing we see a good portion of the liberal establishment like lashing out against protest movements as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And it's a very troubling moment, I think, and for protest movements in general, in terms of how they navigate some of these laws and everything that's being thrown at them. But I do think this is why understanding how we got here is crucial. And I do think that the anti-pipeline movement does tell us something about just the way that the state mobilizes, to state and industry mobilize to counter social movements.
Yeah, and maybe we can, just talking about the industry part as we're moving towards the last of my questions, sort of the interview of this talk. How did TransCanada collaborate with state agencies? There's where they did the tour of the pipeline route, showing things to law enforcement, but was there other collaboration?
There was definitely other collaboration. One of the key, this isn't necessarily state agencies, but the FBI and TransCanada held a training strategy session in 2012, actually not long after this assessment into the groups in South Dakota was opened, which brought together TransCanada and a number of other pipeline-related companies and contractors for a full day of briefings and meetings with the FBI. It's an extraordinary document with the FBI letterhead on one side and TransCanada on the other, essentially working in lockstep to, and I think it's important to point out that the movement, no acts of sabotage or arson or violence had been committed at this stage, as far as I know. The movement was openly committed to nonviolence. They were engaging in politically protected speech, and yet the FBI is treating TransCanada as the quote unquote domain stakeholder and adopting this sort of language that defined the movement as a dangerous terrorist, domestic terror threat. And I think that is where the industry sort of guiding law enforcement really is important, because the oil and gas industry at that time was working hard to try to adopt this kind of language in the way that it characterized the environmental movement, because it saw it as a profound threat.
Yeah, I think Standing Rock really proved their fears correct in many ways. And one of the results of this also is we see actually a number of states, I think it's 11 states now, that have passed like anti-pipeline protest legislation as well, correct? I could be wrong on the number. I always get the numbers wrong.
There's close to 20 states have passed laws that somehow criminalize protest that targets critical infrastructure, whether it's pipelines or utility lines or whatever else it may be. But that specific language can really make it more difficult for activists to engage in direct action related to pipeline construction. If you're going to lock yourself to a pipeline and take on that risk of getting arrested, it's very different if you can be prosecuted under enhanced domestic terrorism charges for that same kind of action. Yeah, many states have adopted those laws, and what we're seeing now with Cop City, these domestic terrorism prosecutions and the use of racketeering charges too, to try to go after activists. So I don't know if this is
criminalizing bail funds.
Right.
Yeah, they're essentially not only going after the activists, but they're also trying to dismantle our support structures, the support structures.
Right.
I'm about at the end of my questions. I actually do have two final questions. Um, what would you say is the sort of, as you wrote this article, which is a great article, but you've written many other articles kind of in this same genre of subject. And I'm curious, what would you say is your main takeaway from what you've seen over the last 10 years or so of what's
Hmm.
going on here? Are we seeing, well, I'll just leave it there, the question there
Well,
for
I think
right now.
one takeaway is that the FBI and law enforcement in general really misread the anti-pipeline movement and underestimated its appeal to a much larger audience. That's one thing, because I think the records clearly illustrate the fact that they did not have a good understanding of who these groups, what was motivating these organizations, and what their tactics were, which, and also relying on an outmoded sort of idea of the environmental movement itself, perhaps, and relying on a kind of. Actually, let me just back up and say that I think that the post 9/11 landscape made it much easier for the FBI to go after these groups in the way that it did, and to open what are called assessments, essentially a level below an official investigation, but they really need to have no cause to open these, and that's what we saw both in Houston and out of the Minneapolis office in South Dakota. So it became easier for them to open these kinds of inquiries, and that essentially allowed them, along with industry, to frame the debate in a certain sense.
It's also post 9/11 where we see the rise of Joint Terror Task Force and fusion centers
Mhm.
and things like that as well, right?
Absolutely, the whole apparatus. I think it's easy to forget how much changed
Mhm.
with the surveillance infrastructure that has emerged. Obviously, this is not necessarily new for the FBI, which has gone after political groups essentially since its inception, as you mentioned before. But
It's
now,
partially why I think they were created.
but now they have many more tools at their disposal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And political, and honestly, political will. There's a lot of political will in the federal political leadership to be able to do these things, both sides of the aisle.
And the environmental movement has long been described as one of the top terror threats in this country.
I'll also say that there's mainstream elements of the environmental movement which completely support the FBI doing things like this too. So
It
just to
may
put
very
that
well
dig in,
be.
knowing what I know. My last question then is, what is next for you in working on this?
Yeah, this piece was in some ways the culmination of almost a decade's worth of Freedom of Information Act work and reporting, and I do have some pending for requests that I hope to start seeing soon. But I'm really hoping to turn this into a book project that can look both at the history of the anti-pipeline movement and also the response that it elicited from FBI and other government agencies.
Excellent. Folks, I've been talking with Adam Federman, who is a reporting fellow at Type Investigations and has published a new article about the federal surveillance, the FBI surveillance of the anti-pipeline, anti-Keystone movement. Adam, thank you for joining us. Folks out there, if you like what you're hearing, just check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you listen to us on the audio platforms, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, give us money, you can go to greenredpodcast.org and hit the support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And I actually don't have one with me, but we also have a bunch of hats. We have swag now. And so if you want a
I
Green and
want
Red
one of those
hat,
hats.
all right. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
$25 donation to
All
the Green
right.
and Red
See what
podcast.
I can do.
I'll hook you up. Thanks for joining us, Adam. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep. Everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.